because of this, maybe in my time period in the U.S. House, the biggest piece of legislation I may have been a part of, I also took more votes on this bill than any other member of Congress in the Oklahoma delegation because of my budget committee assignment. Budget committee and any reconciliation bill has to be the originator, and then they have to be the committee to go back to say, did the other committees comply with what you told them, the budget committee, to do? So that is why you saw multiple times in the process where I was engaged, and it would take a few of us to try to make adjustments to improve the bill. All right, with that said, some of you may be watching social media and the news and what is happening. We've done 100 live town halls. I've never had, up till this week, have to kind of lay a foundation to this level, but there's been some activity on social media designed to try to cause disruption. And I would say that what I want to do is create an atmosphere that where everybody can be heard and listened to, but also that we operate in kindness to each other. Sunday at church, a guy stood up and read through 1 Corinthians 13, which is a reminder. Some of you, when you first got married, right, years ago, maybe it was your mother-in-law who had you hang on your wall, 1 Corinthians 13. Come on, some of you know, Joe, you know what I'm talking about. Love is patient, love is kind, it is not rude, it's not easily provoked, right? Designed to get you and your spouse to communicate a little better, right? Well, he stood up and he's reading through the preface of that. Though I speak with the tongue of angels, though I can fathom all mysteries, though I give my life to the flames as a martyr, though I give away everything I have to the poor, if I don't do those things with love, it's worthless. So I can stand up here, and some of you came in, there's a 10-80-10 rule. You ever heard the 10-80-10 rule? 10% of the people you meet in life, you're going to like them and you don't know why. 80% of people that you meet, they get the opportunity for you to make a decision about them. You're willing to see them in a positive or negative light. And then the other 10% is you like them no matter what. So it's the 10%, 10-80-10. You hate someone, you don't know why. 80% of you are willing to be adjusted, and then you love them. Well, in politics, that's just been normalcy. Then you have the level of politics in that. And some of you came in here loving me because of politics, and some of you came here hating me because of politics, and then it confounds that. And it's real easy when we get political discussion. How many of you had to go Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners with somebody in your family that's of the opposite partisan party? Right? Some of us have figured out how to love each other. I got an aunt. She showed up in the couch. She ran. Representative Dan, Senator Secretary, where's Allie? Thank you for being here. Tom, thank you for being here. If I missed somebody else, I apologize. Y'all correct me. Mark LePack, good to see you. Thanks, man, for coming. I lost my train of thought, Allie. What was I? My aunt. She was at our first town hall, and it created a great atmosphere to say she ran as a state for state office as a Democrat, and she's still a Democrat. And she calls me upset and mad all the time, but I love her, and she loves me. And that 1 Corinthians 13 scripture matters. Y'all, the rest of the nation is not doing town halls. Do you know why? Because we've allowed an atmosphere to be pervasive in politics really the last 10 to 15 years, to where we can't dialogue because everybody screams and yells and shouts. And what happens? Does anybody learn anything? No. An offended brother is more unyielding than a fortified city. So my hope is today, if you disagree with me, and let's be civil. We just came from Okmulgee, and the Democrat Party chairwoman, I did it on the radio, I'll do it in front of you. She asked a question, totally disagreed with me, but she handled herself with class. Total different viewpoint, but she handled the way she did it with class. And I want to be able to return to a place in this country where everybody decides they want to start holding town halls. Okay? So, anyways. All right. I've talked about civility. Oh, I want to pray. Marty, I want to pray. My good friend Marty Quinn back here. Marty, I want to pray. So, Lord, I ask that you would, that's a reminder for me that I would be patient, that I would be kind, that, Lord, that I would not be easily provoked. And that I ask that you would give us a love for one another, even though we disagree, we can do it in a way that is pleasing and honorable unto you in the name of Jesus. Amen. Would you all join me in a salute to our flag? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, we're going to go through speedily. Questions at the end. Y'all, it's going to take a long time. I've done 12 presentations, 12 town halls at this point. I got to go fast. And you'll... Okay. You need to make a flag adjustment, sounds like. Okay. So, we're going to go through this as speedily as I can. We won't get through all of it. You're going to have some questions that page 26, 27, and 28 in your handout. Everybody have a handout? Page 26, 27, and 28. Know that if you're missing some delineation, go to those pages. Says, Jack, where's Jack at? Here. Jack. He's on budget committee staff with me. He works with me on budget committee. We not only have verified all of this through budget committee that I'm on, but we did this together. This is a unique product done for you so that in 2nd Congressional District, I will promise you, you will become more informed than anybody else. As far as I know, this is the detail. Every member of Congress is given information. We took that information and we got with the budget committee and we went into the granular. So that we're not giving you talking points, we're giving you in-depth information. So, Crystal, with Senator Mullins' office, thank you for being here. If I missed somebody else, Crystal, please let me know. Okay. Among the largest tax increase in history, on January 1 of 2026, that was what was going to happen. Do you know why? Because before I got in office in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was signed into law. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 did a significant amount of reductions, right? But many of them were temporary. And so when they're temporary, it means there was an expiration date set upon them. There would be reduction of tax load, but at a certain point, those would expire. That expiration date on almost all of those that weren't permanent was January 1, 2026. So what was going to be the result of that expiration of those temporary tax cuts from 2017? On the average, 22% tax increase on the average American taxpayer. 22% tax increase. So I want you to think of your adjusted gross income. I saw Brian and Jane Treaton here a while ago. I want to at least shout you out because you know, Dan Harrigan would never forgive me if I don't. But for the guys who've worked in governance and so AGI, maybe I'm talking a little too wonky. Brian Treats of the world, the former Chief of Staff of Tom Covert, he gets this, okay? But I'm going to break it down. The AGI, adjusted gross income, when you do your taxes, and that's what you are is relaying that number, that adjusted gross income, take that number, multiply it times 0.22. That's why we got phones now. You don't do it in your head, okay? And then that would have been your tax increase for on the average. That would have $1,700 increase for a family of 4 on the average. For Oklahoma specifically, $1,500 increase on the family of 4. 40 million, the number of families who would see their child tax credit slashed in half. Y'all, in 2017, does anybody remember what the tax credit was that year? It was $1,000. After the One Big Beautiful Bill, the tax credit for each child is now $2,200. Who has children in your home? Okay? Okay. So I'm going to do something. We're going to talk, what is a credit? After you've calculated your taxes, or have them calculated, and you now have a tax liability, the federal, not the state, but the federal, what your tax liability is, or just for ease of math, or I'm going to say let's say you have a $2,200 payment due, to the federal government. Okay? And let's say now, we're going to go back in time to 2017. If you had a $2,200 payment you were about to make to the federal government for your tax liability, and you had one child in your house, a minor, you claimed as a dependent, what was going to be your effective tax rate? What would you have paid to the government? $1,200. Because a tax credit you're about to pay, it's a dollar for dollar reduction what you owe. Don't confuse it yet with a deduction. There's a separation. I'll help you. But a credit is after you calculate your taxes, whatever you owe the federal government, dollar for dollar, whatever the value of the credit is owed to you, you apply that against what you're about to pay the federal government, and it fully offsets that. Okay? All right. So you'd have paid $1,200 to the federal government in 2017, but now, after the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill, permanent, no temporary now, moving forward for all time, unless somebody comes back in Congress and decides to undo this, you have a $2,200 per child tax credit. So now, if you owe the federal government $2,200, how much are you going to pay the federal government? Zero. You owe nothing. You owe nothing. Your effective tax rate is obliterated. All right. Now, if you have multiple children, you do the multiply, another $2,200 per child. So if you owe $4,400 and you have 2 children, how much is your effective tax rate, liability? Zero. All right. So we're going to get in a moment, you're going to realize, oh my gosh, if you don't have a child in your household, but maybe it's grandchildren for your children in their household, you're going to see why this is going to be a major improvement of their tax liabilities. A deduction. When you file your taxes, well, that's a credit. I've already calculated what I owe, dollar for dollar. I don't have to pay that. Most people, a deduction is different. A deduction is either a percentage base or a dollar value, and a deduction is, it's not after you've calculated what you owe the federal government, it's before. And what it is let's say that you made $40,000 last year. You made $40,000, and in 2017, you have a choice to do an itemized deduction or a standard deduction. 90% of all tax filers today do a standard deduction because it's improved over the last several years. Back in 2017, that standard deduction value was $6,000. So let's say in 2017 you're making $40,000. Now you have a standard deduction, and you are going to apply. You're not going to itemize. You're going to do a standard deduction, which 90% of all tax filers utilize that now. But back in 2017, if you applied that standard deduction of $6,000 against your taxable income of $40,000, and you set that $6,000 aside, what is the remainder of the $40,000 that you now owe taxes on? $34,000. Okay? Well, just so happens the One Big Beautiful Bill changed all that. Now the One Big Beautiful Bill says on the standard deduction, you don't just get to set aside $6,000 permanently moving forward for all time. It's not going to expire. You get to set aside $15,000. So now, in this time frame of 2025, if you are making $40,000 and you have a standard deduction as an individual of $15,000, what are you going to do with that deduction? Take that first $15,000 of earnings, set it aside and park it because it's not taxable. Now, how much will you pay taxes on? $25,000. But it gets even better. Because if you jointly file and you're married, that was the individual rate. If you're filing taxes jointly, it's not just $15,000 you get to set aside and not pay taxes on. It doubles. Now it's $30,000 that you get to set aside and pay no taxes on when you jointly file. And for that reason, okay, that's why we want to really zero in this conversation today, the standard deduction, not the credit after you calculate what you owe dollar for dollar. The deduction of what you set aside is going to be very important. So just know, again, for reiteration, if everybody understands, when you have a deduction, it's a standard deduction moving forward per individual. How much is the dollar value? $15,000. You need to remember that. I'll come back here in a minute. All right. Number of small businesses that would have been hit with a tax increase. Y'all, if you have an LLC, how many of you have an LLC? I had one when I had a little Dirtworks business. The reason why my little Dirtworks business, those who are excavator trucking world, I had it. If I went underneath the telephone poles and I had a boom up on an excavator and I brought every telephone pole in the county down, okay, and my general liability, I had a general liability policy, and I didn't have the money if it was capped out, and I was about to lose everything. It's one thing to lose your business and all assets in your business. It's another thing to lose your home. So a lot of people for liability set up an LLC, but don't confuse that as it doing something relative to changing your taxes. And in an LLC, sole proprietorship, multi-member, whatever you have, you still are going to pay individual income taxes even though it's a business. You're going to take individual income tax rates even though it's a business because it just flows through that, and you pay in the 7 marginal tax brackets of the income tax rate. You're going to pay whatever your profit margin was as it flowed in that year from your business to your personal filing at that rate. Okay? Don't confuse that as if you're getting a different tax rate. Okay. So that is why you're going to see how many people would have, even with their business setups, would have seen such a major tax increase. Okay. And that's permanent. The 20% deduction, Jack, were you in the room? That's permanent, correct?
Yes, sir.
That's permanent. when they did in 2017 the corporate tax rate change, that was one of the few elements for corporations that was permanent, that they changed in 2017. We're going to talk about the corporate tax rate change in 2017. We did nothing in the big, beautiful bill relative to corporation tax changes. Nothing. Because that was changed in 2017 permanently. Here in a minute, though, some of you may say, well, couldn't you have gone back and reversed what happened in 2017? Yes, and when we get there, I want to show you what has happened in the corporate tax rate change and what it's done relative to revenue. Okay. The one big, beautiful bill on bonus depreciation. How many of you in here are seeing the good value of cattle prices being up right now? Who's in the cattle business? Okay, if you ranch like I grew up doing, you know that there's about 2 years of good, usually about 2 years of really good calf prices, and never all the other years. Your wife's looking at you when you look at how much you made. There's never a profit, and they're looking at you going, "Why are we doing this? Why do you spend Sundays going out putting out hay all in the wintertime? What value are we getting out of this?" But then you have those 2 years where you actually make a profit, right? It's under those 2 years, if you have a profit, that if you need to go replace the brush hog or the round baler because they're dilapidated, it's those 2 years that you needed to be able to have the finances to afford those. Well, your bonus depreciation, now you have that option with the one big, beautiful bill. You can do it now in the years when cattle prices are good, not depreciation scheduled years when you don't have any taxable liability. That's huge for the agriculture community. But that also applies to the business community. If you needed to replace an excavator because I lost, the pump and the transmission all at the same time and my gears. And I'm like, it'd be better off to go buy one versus, the mechanic bill. I can do it. I can do it in that same year when I had the finances versus years. Some of you in the business world, you know this, especially construction, my world, when it rained, there were not months, many months in that world, you'll sink equipment. You can't work. And that wasn't going to be a good year. In the years that you had a profit and can afford to do those kind of upgrades, those were the years to do it. Bonus depreciation. You now can do that in a one big, beautiful bill. Farm safety net. We had to do something because the farm bill is expiring. We put a temporary extension. That was in the one big, beautiful bill. So we can come back, have more time to be more deliberative. We've talked about the business deduction, 20%, 199A. That is a permanent moving forward. State tax. How many of you have had a family member that's lost a piece of property, know somebody lost a piece of property in the last 30, 40 years because they couldn't afford the taxes on the place? Anybody want to show hands? I actually, on my mother's side, in the 70s, they lost a piece of property because of the death tax. Death being a taxable event. And so for generations, there's been Congress making improvements to say death should not be a taxable event. You pay taxes on all that, all along the lines. And so now permanently, again, Jack verifying this is permanent, not temporary, permanent. We have the death tax dealt with at a $15 million valuation and under. It's a greater value if you're married. If someone passed away years before, passed it to their spouse, then you get a greater value. But if it's just one individual living, and they weren't married before, they had the valuation appraisal, then it is a $15 million valuation, and now death is no longer a taxable event.
That's correct.
What could we do in a reconciliation bill that the one big beautiful bill is? A reconciliation bill created in 1974 in the Budget Control Act says the Budget Committee, of which I was on, sets up the process. They set top-line numbers to reconcile the difference between the spend and revenue coming in. The difference, this chasm between how much is coming in revenue and how much is being spent. That chasm, as you know, for us right now has been $2 trillion. And so the reconciliation, designed to reconcile them, it gives you, according to the Budget Control Act, only one area that you can address: mandatory spending. You cannot touch discretionary. Mandatory means it's mandated. But by law, you can only address mandatory spending. And it had to be a dollar value greater than the policy impact. So, it's important you understand what mandatory is. Mandatory in 1965, page 6 in your handout, was 34% of all the expenditures, which at that time, it was really just Social Security. Mandated, it was going to be paid. You had trustees who managed it, adjusted for inflation year over year. And that is where the payout came for Social Security. It was mandated. Congress wasn't taking a vote on it. It was mandatory. They weren't taking an annual vote on it. Adjusted for inflation, managed by trustees. The rest of this pie chart 66% is where Congress and 12 appropriation bills and discretionary spending, that's where they were actually taking votes. Well, we rock along for a number of years later, and now this is where we're at, where 74% of the budget now is on autopilot. There's no vote taken on it. It's managed for the most part by trustees, adjusted to inflation year over year, and Congress only votes on 26%. What happened? What happened is that Social Security, supported by the payroll tax back then, in the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, what did they add? Medicare. Medicare got added, so that's one more program added to the mandatory side of the ledger. Then Medicaid. Then you had SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, became mandatory. Then you had TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, cash direct payment for those that are under certain incomes. Then you had SSI, not to be confused with Social Security, two trust funds of Social Security, Supplemental Security Income, another cash payment for those who meet income thresholds. And then you have certain veteran benefits became mandatory and interest on the debt. Next slide. And because of those things, page 7 is saying a very similar thing, but it's delineated. This is mandatory. Page 7, left column. On the side, it shows you what's mandatory, what's the specifics of mandatory, and what is defense and non-defense. I've got to put a cough drop in, y'all. This is my insurance that we've got 8 more of these left, and I don't lose my voice, Marty. It's hard to get raspy. Okay. Social Security, mandatory. Net interest, you got to pay it. Of course, take note of the fact that interest payments now, this is discretionary at the bottom. Take note that we've crossed the threshold where interest payments, no principal, just interest payments on the debt is now more than what we spend on national defense. The Ferguson Law in America is now in effect, and the Ferguson Law, as Habsburg Spain and other empires and dynasties and government structures have showed us through history, that when your interest on your debt gets higher than defense, you are in financial trouble to the nth degree. So now we're going to look at Social Security, Medicare. Supposed to be on this side is the revenue. Supposed to be Social Security supported by payroll tax, Medicare supported by the payroll tax. Both mandatory programs, all this mandatory. How much revenue did we bring in last year in the payroll tax? 1.7 trillion. Did we have enough to pay off? Because remember, it's just Congress didn't vote on this. Transferred to trustees. Did we have enough to handle the liabilities of Social Security? Yes, but just barely. But now remember, because Medicare is added to the payroll tax, did we have enough to pay off Medicare? No. It's why when Brian was chief of staff for Tom Coburn, and his wife Jane was working for Dr. Coburn, and and Joni was working for Tom Coburn, and Dan Harrigan was working for Tom Coburn, and I was, wee little field rep in southeast Oklahoma. Dr. Coburn began talking about how Medicare was becoming a problem. It was reaching insolvency way back then because they were already having to pull out of the general fund. It was exhausted. The general fund was having to replace what should have been payroll tax supported. And now we find ourselves in why 10 years from now insolvency hits those programs because the payroll tax cannot keep up with them. Do y'all know what the payroll tax was when it started in 35? 1% each. Now it's to be adjusted by 49 to go to 3%. Okay? Do you know 3% to employee, 3% to employer? Do you know which is 6% total? Do you know what you pay for your Social Security and Medicare payroll tax? 15% sum total. And it's still not being able to keep up with it. Now, this is not voted on. Payroll tax goes directly to these programs. Okay. SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, Medicaid. What could we do in the one big beautiful bill to make adjustments to reconcile? We can only address mandatory. That's why we're going to get to a conversation in a minute about Medicaid and SNAP. One more point I want to make. Remember I told you a while ago that the corporate tax, page 7 bottom, that the corporate tax rate change occurred in 2017 permanently. We didn't do anything in the big beautiful bill on corporate taxes. They changed the rate in 2017 from 35% to 21%. Why? Because depending on what year you looked at, that 35% tax rate was either the second or third or fourth highest corporate tax rate for any corporation in the industrialized world, in the countries, all 200 nations. And so what Congress did in 2017, they said, that doesn't make any sense. We can't compete. and they brought it to 21% and said that we believe is accurate in terms of being able to be competitive, and it's the average of industrialized nations. From 35 to 21%, permanent 21, they did that. Now, we didn't make any adjustments to that in the One Big Beautiful Bill. You say, well, you could have raised the corporation's rate, right? Because some of you in this room believe that corporations need to pay more. Well, I want to show you this. How much revenue did we bring in this last tax year I have up here, according to this chart? The corporate tax rate in 2024 brought in $530 billion. Do you know what it was bringing in 2017, Jack? You got the exact number yet?
Not yet.
It's somewhere between $250 and $300 billion. $250 to $300 billion in 2017 is how much the corporate tax rate at 35% was bringing into revenue to the United States government. And by slashing it from 35 to 21, we almost doubled the amount of revenue coming in to the federal government. So for all of you who would say raise it, you get more revenue, that's wrong. This is an example of the old adage in certain tax policy that whatever you tax, you get less of. Because people were moving their domiciled companies, because they want to be global, to some other country. Let's say they're a United States citizen. They're like, I can make more money going over there with my company. But all of a sudden, when the rate was reduced to the average, people said, I'm a U.S. citizen, I'm going back home. And they brought those companies back, or maybe non-U.S. citizens who want to have more direct control of what was taking place in the market in the U.S. The result is the rising tide lifting all boats. For our revenue, businesses being blessed, and bringing more companies back to the United States. This is tariffs at the bottom. The other, we'll get to that in a later conversation. I want you to look at page 8. Bob Boyd, where you at? I told you last night that we talked about this. You're going to like this stat. I was impressed that you knew this. 17%, bottom of page 8. 17% is the average revenue collected by your government, taken from you, we the people, over the last 65 years. 17%. And what's important about that is the last 65 years, Americans have said, that's how much I'm willing to let my government take from my earnings. On average of the GDP, gross domestic product. And you'll notice anytime we got above that, what did the American people demand? Tax relief. What was going to happen with the One Big Beautiful Bill, termination of certain temporary tax provisions? Where were we headed percentage-wise out in the future if we didn't do the One Big Beautiful Bill? 19%. Is that higher than the 65-year average? Yes, it is. We're pretty particular about how much taxes we're willing to pay in this country. Little motto in 1776, taxation without representation. It's pretty well known. Now, is that a real problem, though, when you look at the two seriated lines here and you see which one's growing faster than the other? Was it as much a revenue or a spending problem causing that? It's our spending problem. What's the reconciliation the One Big Beautiful Bill was? It's to reconcile the difference between spend and revenues. That alligator mouth getting wider. And so what we saw is we were headed towards not just the revenue issues that cause problems, what people were willing to pay, but we had a spending problem way beyond the rate of inflation. Should government grow faster than your economy? No, you can't sustain that. Government, it's only fair that the growth of government should be at least the pace of what your economy is, not more. But if you'll see the hockey stick, we're growing way much past that. So, what I want you to see is, as Reagan said, the reason why we have deficits is not because we tax too little. The reason why we have deficits, this is even if we didn't do the One Big Beautiful Bill. The reason why, Reagan said, we have deficits is not because we tax too little. The reason why we have deficits is because we spend too much. We're going to tackle both in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Who benefited the most? Glad you asked. If you'll look, 15,000 to 50,000, bottom left of page 9, those are the income thresholds in terms of their tax liability. Who falls in the, if you make between $15,000 and $50,000, you get a 17% improvement in your tax liability. You know why that is? What are the two things we learned about earlier? Your standard deduction now is $15,000. Your child tax credit is now $2,200. That's a big part of that. And as you increase in the salary levels between $50,000 and $100,000, the amount of percentage of your tax liability, it doesn't get any better than those in that bottom bracket. So as a percentage, those in the lower income thresholds benefit the most. Standard deduction, how much is standard deduction value? $15,000 per individual, $30,000 if you're married. Okay? All right, keep that in your mind because it's going to really matter even moving ahead. But Josh, that's just percentages. You're skewing the numbers. What about real dollars? I'm glad you asked. This is percentage of all taxes paid on the left-hand side of the column. These are the top 1% that everybody talks about over here. And then we increase those in the earning categories to the top 5%, top 10%, top 25, top 50. Page 10. Page 10 in your handout. And so you want to know, all right, well, how much do the top 1% already pay? What was the biggest bracket of our revenue, y'all? Not payroll tax. Payroll is devoted to Social Security and Medicare. What's the biggest adjustment of our revenue? What was the bucket of revenue? Brings in the most revenue. Which one? Individual income taxes. Individual income taxes, what we're talking about here. That's why it matters. How much does the top 1% pay? If you don't like the fact of USA Facts saying this, you can, right in this moment, pull up the internet and go to the Tax Foundation that Marty Quinn and I, when we were state senators together, a lot of us use Tax Foundation data. It's reputable, it's respected. If you don't like what I'm saying, Mark LePack, Tax Foundation, I'm sure still use Capital Alley. I don't know, I know I'm an older generation, but Tax Foundation, I guess they still send the booklets around. If you don't like my facts, you can pull up Tax Foundation. It's probably the most widespreading of all information you can get. The top 1% pay 42% of all income taxes. The top 1% of earners pay 42% of all income taxes. What about add a few more people in their category? How much do the top 5% pay? They pay almost 60% of all income taxes. What about the top 10%? They pay almost 70% of all income taxes. Top 25% pay almost 90% of all income taxes. Top 25% of all earners, of all income earners, true dollars, pay almost 90% of all income taxes. But then if you go from the top 25 to the top 50%, you pick up another 7 percentage points, because when you look at the top 50% of all earners, the average of America of earners, and everybody above the average, the top 50% of all earners in this country pay 97% of all income taxes. And that begs the question of the average of earnings. Who pays what below the average? What's the average salary in Oklahoma? $36,000. $36,000. So how much, based upon this math, we didn't have a line for this, we should have added it. But if you do the subtraction math, if the top 50% of all earners pay 97% of all taxes, keep in mind, it's the top 25% who are paying almost 90% of all of that. And you pick up a 7% increase just by going to the top 50% of earners. So really, you can see where the tax burden really is the top 25% of earners who pay 90% of all taxes. But what about that bottom 50% of earners? What do they pay? 2.3% of all income taxes. 2.3% of all income taxes. There will still be people in this room. When 1%, the top 1% already pay 42% of all income taxes, you're going to say they don't pay enough. And not for you to answer, but I would say to you rhetorically, how much do you think is enough? Not to be answered. Let's just keep going. All right. If you say, well, Josh, what do they pay percentage-wise? These are the graduated tax brackets on page 11. But I don't want to confuse you. This graduated tax bracket, you have to understand, just because you make $48,000 in this mid-range at it says 22%, that's not the way you calculate that tax. Some of you know this. You don't pay the full 22% against that $48,000. Your first 10% of earnings, you get to pay up to $11,900, 10% on your first $11,900. And then you subtract each level on the way getting. So when you see these percentages, you don't actually pay that full percentage. That's important. That's why this bracket's here for the 7 graduated progressive tax rate that we have on the federal level. But what I want you to know is this person that's slated at making $12,000 or less, $11,900, it says that they're going to pay 10%. Are they going to pay that? Why not? Because of the standard deduction. And because how much is the value of the standard deduction? $15,000. What does the deduction do? You get to take that amount, whether percentage or true dollar amount, and you set it aside as a deduction, and then what's left after that is what you pay taxes on. So if you set $15,000 aside, your first $15,000 and $12,000 earnings, do you have any taxes you pay? No, you do not. Now, let's do something else. So we talked about deductions. We talked about credits. Credits is after you calculate your taxes, and for every dollar value, that $2,200 assigned to each child is one example of a credit, you get to reduce your tax liability. There's something else called a refundable tax credit. a refundable tax credit that Marty Quinn and I worked handily on the wind industry at the state capitol years ago. The wind industry, we discovered, gets a refundable tax credit. And you know what a refundable tax credit is? A refundable tax credit says you don't have to owe a dime in income taxes. But based upon some special category, you don't have to pay a dime of any federal tax, or state tax in that case. And we'll pay you as the government based upon something we see you doing that we like. And for the wind and solar category, it's for every kilowatt hour of electricity produced. They don't owe a dime in taxes, and you take it from everybody in this room. It used to be on the state level, thanks to Marty and others who helped correct this. We all were striving to in 2018, and we got quite there, Marty. We got quite there, but then they were able to get some things over the line later on and finally solve it. But back then, it was just on the state refundable tax credit on wind. It was taking $20 from everybody in this room's pocket to give the wind industry. And they didn't know a dime in it. That's just your state tax. But on the federal side, there's a federal per kilowatt hour production tax, refundable tax credit given to them. It's even greater. And so that's called a refundable tax credit. You don't owe a dime in taxes, but the government pays you because they think you're special. Wind and solar, keep that in mind. But there's something called the earned income tax credit, also for people that meet certain income guidelines. It's also where some of your CPAs, you know this, even though you may not pay a dime in income taxes, so the standard deduction now. That's why you hear people who don't pay taxes who get the earned income tax credit getting money back from the government. That's also another refundable tax credit. Okay. Medicaid. You're hearing all this clamor about what's going to happen on Medicaid, y'all. In 2014, we did something different called the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And what happened under Obamacare is they changed what the Lyndon B. Johnson administration created as the original intent of Medicaid was to be only available for the blind, the aged, the disabled, the pregnant or nursing mothers, caretakers of the indigent, or those that were below the poverty line. You see the poverty line? And why Paragon put this chart out, that I became very notorious in Congress in the first few months showing people, is we had now reached a point with our Medicaid population. We had more people above the poverty line by 2022 than below the poverty line. And that was disenfranchising in terms of availability of service. It was disenfranchising the traditional population, the disabled, the elderly, the blind, those that couldn't afford things. Post-Obamacare, we were signing up people that were able to work, not disabled, at 138% according to the poverty guidelines. And a population explosion was happening. And if you look over time, as I showed you a while ago, in 10 years we were almost doubling our Medicaid numbers. What we were spending from the federal government. You know why that Medicaid growth was doing that and the government couldn't keep up with it? The historic population, the states, think California when you think states, because they're the worst offender on this. The states for the traditional, the handicapped, the disabled, the elderly, the states would pay 40% in the last 30 years on average of the tab at the hospital bill, for the hospital bill, the nursing home bill, and the Fed would pay 60% of that bill. But post-2014, what happened was, when they added all these non-disabled people to Medicaid, now they changed the reimbursement rate to the states. And they said to the states, we're going to give you more money for the able-bodied than we give you for the disabled. We're going to give you $9 for every $10 you give us, states. And so if you're a state like California, guess what? It's in your state budget purview to do. Is it more in your purview to focus on the traditional disabled population, or you get more money if you focus on the able-bodied population? Which one? If you're a state lawmaker in California and will bring more money to your state, you're going to put more value on signing up more people able-bodied and service provisions for those people than you are the disabled. Okay? But I want you to see something. When in our history have we actually reduced poverty? Because that's what we're missing. That's the real goal on the social safety net, is reducing poverty. You're going to see 2 times in our history where you've seen the poverty in the last 40-year history where poverty's gone down. Page 14. This year's right here. And what happened? Bill Clinton signed Newt Gingrich's. Brian, were you on the Hill when this happened? You weren't? Dr. Kober came in 94. Okay. They signed a contract with America, and then they began to implement on those promises. And part of that was work requirements on SNAP. What happened to the poverty line, the Bill Clinton-era work requirements on SNAP? What happened to the poverty line? This is the history of growth of poverty in our country. What happened? It went down. So what does that tell you work requirements do? It blesses a country because the poverty rate goes down. You see, one more time here in the Trump administration, do you see Medicaid rolls increasing at an exponential rate? No. What happened to the poverty line? It went down. It's not, the goal should not be sign more people up on government programs. The goal should be to reduce the poverty line. So learning from Clinton-era work requirements, that's why we implemented work requirements in the One Big Beautiful Bill. And that's why when you hear the CBO now coming out and saying these millions of people are going to lose their coverage, they're not telling you other facts. 4.8 million of those, page 15, can still stay on Medicaid if they'll just choose to work 20 hours a week. If they'll choose to go to work 20 hours a week, or they'll choose to get an education for 20 hours a week, or if they'll choose to do community service, Claremore, Oklahoma, for 20 hours a week, they can still remain on Medicaid. The problem is, what we saw from the Clinton era, they know based on experience, people won't do that. And that's why they're telling you these 5 million people are no longer be on Medicaid. You're hearing this, all these people are going to lose Medicaid. It's because they're going to choose not to work. That's where the expectation comes from. But if they choose to work, can they stay on Medicaid? Yes, they can. These are the able-bodied, not the disabled. Do not confuse what I'm saying. There's no work requirement for the disabled, the elderly, the blind, the indigent. We're not talking about the indigent, the impoverished. We are talking about those that are above the poverty rate, and able to work. And able to work. So, let's go to 1.4 million they're talking about. Illegal aliens on Medicaid. You said it didn't happen. Give me a minute. We're going to come to a chart and I'll show you. Another 1.3 million the CBO is talking about. That 1.3 million is going to lose coverage because they don't qualify because they make too much money. You say, well, why would they be on Medicaid? Because under the Biden administration, they allowed 2 years to lapse where you sign up and say you make a certain amount of money. You have to have income verification. And Biden's administration said, we're not going to come back and check. They let 2 years lapse and never check to see if they were actually eligible for Medicaid. And so what we did in the One Big Beautiful Bill, to be fair to you, the taxpayer, to make sure real people in need are the ones getting the benefits, we said every 6 months you are going to have to reapply for Medicaid verification forms that you still make less than the threshold. All right. Even if you're not still convinced that Medicaid is not being discarded like you're hearing the rhetoric out there say that it is, here's the actual numbers on page 16. Year over year, billions of dollars increased year over year, page 16. Congress is going to continue to put more money to Medicaid every year, but what rate? At the rate of inflation, not faster than the rate of inflation like is where it was headed. And I'm hearing the hospitals are going to close. I've already proven to you the rate of inflation. They're going to get more money year over year. What you're not seeing is, you're not hearing them people talk about, is we plussed up a fund at $50 billion over a 5-year period to say every state now, Oklahoma, will be automatically eligible for $25 billion among the 50 states. Okay? Of half of the $50 billion. Oklahoma will be among all 50 states to get, because of your state status, you get percentage of that $25 billion. In addition to that, there's another $25 billion based upon need as applications prove out. There's $50 billion to plus up. Y'all, Oklahoma's entire state budget right now, Allie, help me out. What's your state budget? 12, 13 billion? We're talking about plussing up almost 4 or 5 times Oklahoma state budget just to help those that would have need in the healthcare industry. The Oklahoma state budget total. Oklahoma state budget for roads and bridges and education is in that range. And 5 times over that amount is what this bill is plussed up. The entire state's budget to make sure if anybody says there's any issues, there's a fund to take care of that. Josh, the illegals aren't getting Medicaid. You're wrong. Page 18, Paragon, here's the proof. Go through it for speed of delivery. But not only were they giving illegals Medicaid, remember they're getting $9 for every $1 the state put in. It was to their advantage to sign up as many people that were able-bodied as they could. Because they didn't have any skin in the game. And they were utilizing it for non-Medicaid purposes also, non-healthcare purposes. There was a point in the budget committee we were looking around going, if we could just get California's numbers back to 2021, Tom, we would have solved our budget problem somewhere around May, June. just California alone, because they were the worst offender of scamming Medicaid. Page 19. All right, Josh, what about debt and deficits? Glad you asked. This is a chart, page 19. This shows balance, zero. Right here, see the word balanced? Come right across, that's zero. The CBO, after the big beautiful bill, said it's going to cost $3.4 trillion over the 10-year window that would be added to debt. That's what CBO said. But what the CBO didn't get right, and what the CBO is not really making known to you, is that they calculated, because growth happens. Remember, you're going to have growth of government, but you're going to have growth of economy. And the growth of your economy creates what? An increase in revenue. So your economy grows year over year, percentage base, you get more revenue. What they suggested as the increase year over year of revenue, the CBO, next page, we're going to hold this temporarily, is on page 20, next page. They said, far right column, we're only going to get 1.8% year over year revenue increase. The budget committee, Jody Arrington leading this with us, a few of us in that meeting back early spring, we said no. 2.6% is what we believe is reasonable. Well, how can you be so far off of CBO's 1.8 to 2.6? Because we believe reasonable, pre-COVID, Trump, he averaged 2.8%. And then the entirety of Biden's administration, he averaged 2.7%. And then since World War II, we've averaged 3.1%. Now, there are blips and there are hiccups, and when you get past 90% debt to GDP ratio, there's a lag on your economy. So can I tell you for certain we'll hit 2.6? No, I cannot. But we felt like we weren't stretching ourselves too far to be able to say we think that's reasonable. Okay? CBO said 1.8. Budget committee said 2.6. CBO is the one you hear from more. So what we did in the budget committee is we knew the difference between the revenue that would come in between their 1.8 year over year growth and our 2.6 just so happened to be another 2.6. The difference between 1.8% growth and 2.6% growth is $2.6 trillion more in federal revenue coming in that 10-year period. Which you will find reflected right here. The difference between what the CBO said and what the budget committee said is $2.6 trillion of more revenue that will come in based upon what the rationale we used. And so when you're looking for balance on page 19, of what CBO says our debt score will be over 10 years, we, just by growth, what we believe is reasonable growth, filled a massive amount of hole. And then it came time for the vote. Because that blue segment that now you see tariffs in, when Chip Roy, myself, Andrew Clyde, and Ralph Norman stopped the bill because of my concerns over the wind tax and solar tax stuff, I wanted to make sure those numbers were not a lie. Because I'd seen what had happened. We're going to get there quickly. I'll just know that what I had seen happen, why I held that bill up, was because before we sent this thing over to the Senate, we fixed that gap right there so it did not have to be filled with tariff money. We sent it to the Senate because of our negotiations, and we got a legitimacy on a number of different factors. Now, the Senate has a rule that the House doesn't have. It's called the Byrd Rule. It requires them compliance. So some of what we negotiated against, not what Chip and Ralph and Andrew and I negotiated against on wind and solar refundable tax credits, but some other things that had already been put in the bill had to be removed because of the lack of Byrd compliance. But there were other things like what Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, she didn't like what the hard bargain that we had worked out with the White House, I want you to hear this, with the White House willing partner in, because they had knew ending the Green New Scam was a part of their agenda. So we had a willing partner at the White House and with leadership. We had some members that were a little uncomfortable. You can imagine there's Republicans that support wind and solar refundable tax credits. They're out there. I want to have a good conversation over dinner one night and explain to them, that's unfair, but they're just not there yet. So you got some Republicans who support wind and solar refundable tax credits. And because of that, when it went to the Senate, when we had balance, full balance, when we voted on the Senate to the House, man, we were chanting, oh, this is awesome. Then we got the bad news. The bill comes back. And you want to know why I was one of 8 sluggish to vote for it? We went to see the president. We met with the president, his team. He knew our concerns about the changes that Lisa Murkowski, as the foremost on, had made, not fully gutting what we'd worked on, the wind and solar stuff, but she had been able to create a loophole. We had great concerns over that. The president and his team made a significant assurance to us, because he sees it our way, that we were going to fix that. And we couldn't fix it in the legislation because they were convinced if we went back to the Senate, it would get worse. because of the tight margin they had over there. 3 days after we voted for the one big beautiful bill, we were going to find an executive order that was signed based upon significant assurances that the president gave us. And that executive order tightened what the definition of commenced construction is for wind and solar. I don't have time to go through that, but I want you to know part of the rationale is how I got to a yes. Ultimately, up until 3 a.m. that morning, I was with the speaker. And then a few others elsewhere. The president didn't know, I don't know if he knew or didn't know, but even up until 3 a.m., the president's team was in negotiations. Still were some things left to be ironed out. We got there about 3, 4 a.m. that morning. What I did not want to have to do is come before you and have to say we have to have 3.5 years of tariffs to get to balance. But that's the reality. But I can tell you, I did everything I could. The way it passed out of the House was balanced in math. I could not fix what changes came back to us. But what I will tell you is the full President Trump effect on the one big beautiful bill. He wanted the bill. He pressed for the bill. He is the driving force behind the leverage on the bill. Ultimately, but even with him adding this 3.5 years of tariffs, 3.5 years of tariffs, we now have balance. The full Trump effect over the 10-year window, for those of us who think debt and deficits, we now have balance. If we miss the mark on the 2.6% year-over-year growth, I've got some good news for you. See this little yellow bucket down here? That's excess. Because the likelihood is the 10% tariff moving forward because Biden did not repeal Trump's previous tariffs. And what the CBO is now giving us a score of in the last 2 weeks is now wrong, but for the better, Tom Gann. We're not going to get only $2.2 trillion over a 10-year window at the 10% floor. We're going to get $4 trillion. So my graph, we set this thing up a week or two ago, my graph's wrong now because you need another yellow bucket for an additional $1.5 trillion more over the 10-year window, which gives us a significant amount of pad. But you say, well, Josh, what happens with tariff adjustments? And the 10% floor is going to stay there for the 3 years. It's just, I don't see it not changing, going anywhere. But there's additional news. Look at page 19. This year, part of the big, beautiful bill, thanks to Chip Roy, and I'm sick about losing him running for Attorney General, but thanks to Chip Roy and Russ Vought, in a really wise move early on in this process, we got together and we said, because of the way the appropriation bill process works out every year, we have to, in the current environment, we would have to have 7 Democrats in the discretionary budget, not mandatory, but the discretionary budget, which I go back in a few weeks to vote on, next week. Next week? I think it's next week. Anyways, that discretionary budget, because we've done some plus-ups on the defense side, we've taken care of some defense things that gives us a great chance now to do a flat budget. And a flat budget, part of the consideration of one big beautiful bill, you don't even see this number, is another $500 billion over a 10-year window, just by 1 year adjustment, according to CBO. Now, if we can do it for 4 years, it's $1.4 trillion. We bought enough in the mandatory increase of defense, we got a chance maybe to do 2, maybe 3. So we got, but $500 billion is additional pad. And that came as a result of the negotiations that happened in the one big beautiful bill. All right, y'all, when we left conference, Republican conference in Florida in spring, leadership said $300 billion is what we're going to save in this bill. And because of a group of about 10 to 15 of us, Budget Committee and Freedom Caucus, we kept driving bargains you never saw in February and March with the speaker. And I'm thankful to Mike Johnson. He took a gamble with us. There's about 5 of us in the room early March, and Jody Arrington and some of us. He took a gamble with us that we could get to 1.5. And we both told him he won't get out of this committee if we can't get to 1.5. And what the full conference had voted on was $300 billion in savings. And why Mike Johnson can now stand up and say this is the largest savings ever accomplished in any measure, even adjusted for inflation, is because we moved it from $300 billion to $1.7 trillion in savings. Now, keep in mind, though, yes, it's the most amount of savings, but there's a large spend amount. I don't have time to go through. Y'all, we plussed up defense. We plussed up the physical barriers. 700 more mile of physical barriers done, paid for in this bill. We will, as much physical barriers we can get in the 2,000-mile border. Y'all know I'm on Homeland Security. It's paid for, plus technology, plus 18,000 more ICE agents, plus increasing CBP, those that are actually processing. And there's so much more in this, but I don't have time because I'd need to let you have time to visit. Let me show you one thing quickly. That right there This is why wind and solar why some of us threw down over wind and solar. Why it had to be done in Trump's term. This is the 13 different times since the 1990s for wind on the production tax credit that Congress said sometime in the future we'll actually do that. And before we held that thing up, that 3-day window, that weekend, that's exactly what was in the bill. Another promise to end the subsidies after President Trump's term. And it's why we all called that for what it was, a lack of truth. It's why we held it up that weekend. Some of you were frustrated with me, but I want you to see why. 13 different times, the history of Congress, the greatest predictor of the future is the past. They had said after this amount of time, we'll cut that thing off. And they've never done it because of lobbyist money that came around and changed Congress's mind. And that's why on the one big beautiful bill, the argument that we made under the President's administration, ending this unfair subsidization that is taking Oklahoma jobs, because 60% of all new growth on the electric grid in this country has been from wind and solar. Solar gets 60 to 80% of all of their components from China. It's global. That's not just U.S. 60 to 80%, depending on what different components of solar you're talking about, are built, manufactured, and shipped from China. And what we've been doing with 60% of all new growth in the last several years of our electric grid going to wind and solar, we have been displacing natural gas, Oklahoma jobs, because Oklahoma is a top 5 producer of natural gas. We've been displacing those jobs and sending those jobs to China. Does the Chinese Communist Party want America blessed? No. It's foolishness that we are taking our tax dollars, refundable tax credit, when they don't have a dime, and sending it to those companies and cutting our own nose to spite our face. And this is why we had to do it under President Trump's term. That's what that weekend was about. I owe it to you to give you explanations. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Sometimes you're going to see some things I'm doing, you're going, what is he doing? I can't tell you I'm always going to be infallible, right? Nobody is. George Washington said, if God could grant a standard of infallibility among political opinion, there's no being other than myself would resort to it with more ignorance. But as long as I remain a servant of the public, I'm held by these maxims: upright intentions and close examination of the facts. It's the best you can hope for, is that you study the facts and you have upright intentions when you cast votes and you do what you do. So for those of you who hung with me and weren't that mad with me for that weekend, thank you. We got a good result. All right, let's open it up to questions. Yes, ma'am.